The cream envelope trembled in his hand. Vivian Hart, CEO in Scarlet, had just whispered at the edge of the gala, "I will be your gift." Adrian Cross read the words, and something shattered behind his eyes. Without speaking, he took her wrist, urgent, almost desperate, and led her away from the champagne and laughter. She expected gratitude, maybe joy. But when they reached the private room and he finally looked at her, his expression held devastation, not desire. "You have no idea what you've just done," he whispered, his artist's hands shaking with a weight she couldn't name. Adrian Cross had learned to compartmentalize his life into neat boxes. There was the morning box, where he made pancakes for Iris and braided her hair before school. There was the office box, where he transformed into the sharp CFO who could read balance sheets like poetry. And there was the night box, the dangerous one, where he stared at old photographs and remembered what it felt like to hold a paintbrush instead of a pen. The boxes kept him functional. They kept him from falling apart. But Vivian Hart's letter had just torn through every single one of them. The private room was dimly lit, borrowed light from a desk lamp casting shadows across Vivian's face. She looked vulnerable in a way he'd never seen during board meetings. Her shoulders were bare except for thin straps, and she was watching him with those green eyes that always seemed to see too much. Adrian forced himself to breathe. The letter had fallen to the floor between them, 3 sentences that should have made him happy. 3 sentences that, instead, felt like a knife twisting in his chest. He had spent 2 years building this moment. 2 years of late nights studying financial models he had no natural talent for. 2 years of sitting across from Vivian in meetings, watching her make decisions with a clarity that reminded him painfully of his sister. 2 years of telling himself that when the time came, when he had enough evidence to destroy Robert Hart's empire, he would feel nothing but satisfaction. But now she was standing here, offering him her heart, and all he felt was sick. Vivian took a step closer. Her perfume reached him, something with bergamot and amber that he'd memorized without meaning to. "Adrian," she said softly, and the way she said his name made something crack open inside him. "I know this is forward. I know we work together. But I'm tired of pretending I don't feel this." She reached for his hand, and he let her take it even though he knew he shouldn't. Her fingers were cool against his palm. "You're the first person in years who's looked at me like I'm just Vivian, not the Hart Empire, or my father's daughter, or some prize to be won. You see me." The words hit him like a physical blow. She had no idea how much he saw, how he'd memorized every detail about her while planning her family's downfall, how he knew she took her coffee with too much sugar and stayed late on Thursdays to avoid her father's dinner invitations, how she'd quietly redirected company funds to charity projects Robert Hart would never have approved, how she was nothing like the man who'd killed Adrian's family, his family. The thought snapped him back to reality. Somewhere across town, Iris was asleep in the apartment they shared, the antique brooch pinned to her pajama collar like always. She wore it every night, that small paintbrush pin that had belonged to her mother. Adrian's mother first, then his sister, Natalie, and now Iris. The last piece of the Cross family that Robert Hart hadn't managed to steal or destroy. Except he had. The brooch had been sold at auction after the accident, liquidated along with everything else. Adrian had spent 6 months tracking it down and buying it back under a fake name. "Say something," Vivian whispered. Her thumb traced circles on his wrist, a gentle gesture that made him want to pull away and pull her closer at the same time. "Even if it's no, I just need to know." Adrian looked at her, really looked at her, the hopeful tilt of her chin, the slight tremble in her shoulders, the way she was trying so hard to be brave about this, to offer herself to someone she thought she knew. He was going to hurt her. Not tonight, maybe, but eventually. When the truth came out, when she learned that every conversation they'd ever had was built on lies, she would hate him. and she would be right to. But he was so tired of being alone, so tired of the boxes and the compartments and the careful distance he maintained from everyone except Iris. And standing here in this dim room with Vivian's hand in his, Adrian made the worst decision of his life. He closed the distance between them. He let himself kiss her, let himself pretend, for just one night, that he was the person she thought he was. A good man, an honest man, someone who deserved the gift she was offering. Her response was immediate, warm, and so achingly genuine that it made his chest hurt. She kissed him like she'd been waiting for this, like she'd imagined it 100 times, and the reality was somehow better. Her hands found their way to his shoulders, his neck, threading through his hair. And Adrian let himself forget. He forgot about revenge and balance sheets and the police report hidden in his apartment. He forgot about the recordings and the evidence and the careful plan he'd been building. For a few stolen hours, he was just a man with a woman who cared about him, and it felt like drowning and breathing at the same time. When he left before dawn, Vivienne was still sleeping. Adrian dressed quietly, his movements automatic while his mind screamed at him. He found a piece of paper on her desk and wrote 2 words. "I'm sorry." He didn't explain. How could he? How do you tell someone that you're sorry for taking what they offered? Sorry for wanting it? Sorry for the fact that you're going to break their heart? He left the note on the pillow next to her and walked out into the cold December morning, feeling like he'd just committed a crime. The drive home was a blur. By the time Adrian pushed open the apartment door, the sun was starting to rise, painting everything in shades of gray and gold. Iris was awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her colored pencils spread out in front of her. She looked up when he entered, and her smile faded immediately. Kids had a way of seeing through pretense that adults had long forgotten. "Dad," she said, using the title that wasn't technically correct, but had become truth through repetition. "You look sad." She climbed down from her chair and wrapped her small arms around his waist. The brooch pinned to her nightgown pressed against his ribs. "Did you have a bad dream?" Adrian knelt down to her level, pulling her into a proper hug. She smelled like the lavender soap they used and the faint scent of colored pencils. "Something like that, sweetheart," he managed. Over her shoulder, he could see the drawings spread across the table. Stick figures holding hands, a house with a garden, a woman with long hair and a smile. Natalie. Even after 5 years, Iris still drew her mother, trying to hold on to memories that were already fading. "I was drawing Miss Hart," Iris said, pulling back to look at him. "From the company picnic, remember? She played tag with me, and she didn't even care that she got grass stains on her dress. Can I meet her again sometime?" Adrian felt something twist in his gut. "Maybe," he said, which was a lie. After what he was planning, after the truth came out, Iris would never see Vivian Hart again. None of them would. "Come on, let's get you ready for school." The morning routine helped. Pancakes with chocolate chips, braiding Iris's hair, which had gotten long enough now that it reminded him painfully of Natalie's. Packing her lunch with an extra juice box because Thursdays were art class, and she always came home thirsty and excited. These small acts of care kept him grounded, kept him from thinking too hard about the warmth of Vivian's skin or the way she'd whispered his name like a prayer. At the office, Adrian threw himself into work with an intensity that his assistant noticed but didn't comment on. He had a meeting at 10, another at noon, a conference call at 2. The CFO of Hart Corporation didn't have time for existential crises. He reviewed the quarterly reports, flagged 3 accounting discrepancies that weren't actually suspicious, but gave him an excuse to dig deeper, and responded to 37 emails. And through it all, he felt Vivian's presence like a weight on his chest. She found him at 4 o'clock, knocking on his office door, with a tentative confidence that told him she was nervous. Adrian looked up from his computer, and the moment their eyes met, he knew she'd been thinking about last night too. She was wearing a navy suit today, her hair pulled back in a professional twist, but there was something softer in her expression, something that made his carefully constructed walls feel dangerously thin. "Hi," Vivian said, closing the door behind her. She held 2 cups of coffee, his with too little sugar, hers with too much. A peace offering, maybe, or an acknowledgement. "I thought we could talk." Adrian took the coffee because refusing would have been too obvious. The cup was warm against his palms. "About last night," he started, but she held up a hand. "You don't have to explain the note," she said. "I'm not asking for promises or definitions or anything complicated. I just wanted you to know that I don't regret it. What I wrote in the letter, I meant it." She paused, searching his face. "But if this is too much, if I've made you uncomfortable, we can go back to how things were. Professional. Just colleagues." The offer was genuine. Adrian could see that. She would let him walk away if he asked, would pretend it never happened, would protect his dignity even at the cost of her own vulnerability. It would have been the smart choice, the safe choice. But Adrian had already crossed too many lines to pretend he could go back now. "I don't want to go back," he heard himself say. The words came out rough, almost angry, which wasn't fair to her, but was all he could manage. "I can't promise this will work out, Vivian. I can't promise I won't hurt you. But I don't want to pretend last night didn't happen." Her smile was like sunrise, warm and gradual and devastating. "Okay," she said simply. "Then let's see where this goes." She set her coffee down on his desk and moved around to his side. Before Adrian could protest or prepare, she kissed him. It was brief, almost chaste, but it carried the weight of decision. They were doing this, whatever this was, and God help them both. The next few weeks were a careful dance. At the office, they maintained professional distance. No one suspected that the CFO and CEO were anything but colleagues who respected each other's work. But after hours, when Iris was asleep and the world had quieted down, Adrian would find himself on the phone with Vivian, talking about everything and nothing. She told him about growing up in the Hart Mansion, about the pressure of carrying a family name that meant something in this city. He told her carefully edited versions of his childhood, enough truth to feel honest, enough omission to protect his secrets. She met Iris on a Saturday morning at a park. Adrian hadn't planned it, but Iris had asked so many questions about the nice lady from the picnic that he'd finally given in. He watched them together on the playground, Vivian in jeans and a sweater, looking nothing like a CEO. Iris chattering about her art class and her favorite books. And when Iris showed Vivian the brooch pinned to her jacket, when Adrian saw Vivian's expression shift from interest to something he couldn't quite read, he knew his time was running out. "That's beautiful," Vivian said, crouching down to Iris's level. Her fingers hovered near the brooch, but didn't quite touch. "Where did you get it?" "It was my Aunt Natalie's," Iris said proudly. "She died when I was little, but Dad says she loved art just like me. The paintbrush means she was an artist. Dad says I can keep it forever." Adrian saw the exact moment recognition clicked in Vivian's mind. Saw the way her eyes widened slightly, the way her gaze snapped to his face with a question she couldn't ask in front of a 7-year-old. He'd been so careful. He'd covered every track, erased every connection between Adrian Cross and the family his father had destroyed. But he'd forgotten about the brooch, that one small piece of evidence that had been sold at a public auction, catalogued and photographed and documented. "Natalie," Vivian repeated slowly. "That's a lovely name." But her voice had changed. There was a thread of tension there now, something uncertain and seeking. "What was her last name?" Adrian felt the ground shift beneath him. "Cross," he said, because lying now would only make it worse. Natalie Cross. The silence that followed was heavy. Iris, oblivious, had already run off to the swings, leaving Adrian and Vivian standing in the cold December air with 5 years of secrets hanging between them. Vivian stood slowly, her movements careful, controlled. When she finally looked at him, her expression was carefully neutral. "Cross," she repeated. "That's an interesting coincidence." It wasn't a coincidence. They both knew it. The Cross family had been a fixture in this city before the accident. Cross Industries had held patents on 3 revolutionary technologies before Robert Hart had swooped in during the chaos following the tragedy, acquired the company for pennies on the dollar, and built Hart Corporation into what it was today. The story had been buried in business journals from 12 years ago, but it was there if you knew where to look. "Vivian," Adrian started, but he didn't know how to finish the sentence. What could he say? That he'd been lying since the day they met? That every conversation, every shared coffee, every moment had been part of a plan? That somewhere along the way the plan had stopped mattering, but he'd been too far gone to stop? "Not here," she said quietly. Her face had gone pale. "Not with Iris around. But Adrian, you need to tell me the truth. All of it." She glanced toward the swing set where Iris was pumping her legs, flying high with the kind of joy that only children could access. "You owe me that much." He did. He owed her so much more than that. "Tonight," he agreed. "After Iris is asleep, I'll come to your place and I'll tell you everything." Vivian nodded once, sharp and decisive. Then she walked over to Iris to say goodbye, smiling and hugging the little girl with a warmth that made Adrian's chest ache. She didn't look at him again before she left, just climbed into her car and drove away, leaving Adrian standing in the park with the weight of his impending confession pressing down on him like gravity. That evening, Adrian tucked Iris into bed with extra care. He read 3 stories instead of 2, checked under the bed for monsters, made sure her nightlight was working. She looked up at him with Natalie's eyes, so trusting it made him want to cry. "Is Miss Vivian going to be my friend now?" Iris asked sleepily. Adrian smoothed her hair back from her forehead. "I hope so, sweetheart. But sometimes grown-up relationships are complicated." "That's a silly answer," Iris mumbled, already half asleep. "Either people care about each other or they don't. That's what Aunt Natalie used to say, right? Before the angels took her. Before the angels took her. That's how they talked about the accident." A car crash, they told Iris. Quick and painless, which was another lie. Adrian had read the police report. He knew exactly how long it had taken, exactly how much his family had suffered. And he knew Robert Hart's name appeared in that report as a witness, which was the biggest lie of all. Vivian's apartment was in one of the older buildings downtown, the kind with crown molding and hardwood floors that creaked. She opened the door before Adrian could knock, like she'd been waiting. Her eyes were red-rimmed. She'd been crying, or trying not to, and the sight of it made him feel like the worst kind of villain. "Come in," she said. Adrian stepped inside. The apartment was neat, organized, filled with books and art that suggested a person who valued beauty and knowledge. On her desk, he could see papers spread out, articles, old news clippings. She'd been researching. Of course she had. Vivian Hart didn't do anything halfway. "I found them," she said, gesturing to the papers. "The articles about the accident, Cross Industries, your family." She picked up one of the clippings with shaking hands. Adrian Cross, age 22, survived along with his 7-year-old niece, Iris. Parents Daniel and Margaret Cross, deceased. Sister Natalie Cross, deceased. The company was acquired by Hart Corporation 3 months later. She looked up at him with devastated eyes. "You're that Adrian Cross." "Yes," he said. There was no point in denying it now. "You came here for revenge. It wasn't a question." "Yes," he said again. "The CFO position, getting close to me, everything." Her voice was remarkably steady considering how pale she'd gone. It was all part of a plan. "At first," Adrian said. He moved closer, needing her to understand even if she couldn't forgive. "At first, that's all it was. I taught myself finance because I needed access to Hart Corporation's records. I needed to find proof of what your father did." "What my father did," Vivienne repeated slowly. She set down the clipping and picked up another document. This one Adrian recognized. The police report. She'd found it faster than he'd expected. This report says the accident was caused by brake failure. Faulty maintenance. It was ruled an accident. It was ruled an accident because your father paid people to make sure it was ruled an accident, Adrian said. The words came out harsh, bitter with 5 years of grief. My father wouldn't sell. Cross Industries was his life's work. So Robert Hart arranged for our family car to have an unfortunate mechanical failure on a stretch of mountain highway. He pulled out his phone, pulled up a file, and held it out to her. This is a recording from a private investigator I hired 2 years ago. Your father talking to his lawyer about loose ends from 2012, about making sure the Cross acquisition stayed buried. Vivienne took the phone with numb fingers. Adrian watched her face as she listened to her father's voice, cold and businesslike, discussing murder like it was a merger negotiation. He watched her crumple, slowly, like a building folding in on itself. When the recording ended, she sat down heavily on her couch. He killed them, she whispered. My father killed your family, for a company, for patents and market share and money. She looked up at Adrian with eyes full of horror. And I've been running that company, using their money, living in a house built on blood. You didn't know, Adrian said, but the words felt inadequate. I should have known. Vivienne's hands were shaking. There were always things that didn't add up, questions my father wouldn't answer. But I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was imaging things because I wanted to find flaws in him. A tear slid down her cheek. God, Adrian, I've been sleeping in silk sheets bought with your family's lives. Stop! He couldn't watch her torture herself, couldn't stand the way she was pulling all of his father's guilt onto her own shoulders. Vivienne, you are not responsible for what Robert Hart did. You were 20 years old when it happened. You were in grad school. You had no way of knowing. But I'm his daughter. She looked at him with something close to desperation. How can you even stand to look at me? How can you stomach being in the same room as me after what he did? That was the question, wasn't it? The one Adrian had been asking himself for weeks now. Because you're not him, he said finally. I've been watching you, Vivienne, really watching you. The way you treat people. The way you corrected 3 different projects that would have been unethical, but profitable. The way you donated your own salary bonus to fund grief counseling programs in the community. You are nothing like your father. But I offered myself to you. Fresh tears spilled over. That letter. God, I threw myself at the man whose family my father destroyed. How can you not hate me? Because I love you, Adrian said, and the admission felt like stepping off a cliff. I didn't want to. I tried not to. But somewhere between the revenge plot and the coffee meetings, and watching you play with Iris, I fell in love with you. And I hate myself for it, because you deserve someone honest, someone without all this damage. But that's the truth. Vivienne stared at him. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then she stood up, walked over to where he was standing, and slapped him. Not hard, but with enough force to snap his head to the side. That's for lying, she said. Then she kissed him, desperate and tearful and absolutely wrecking. And that's because I love you too, you idiot. They stood there in her apartment, holding each other like lifelines, both crying now. It should have been romantic. It should have been a resolution. But Adrian knew this was just the beginning of something much harder. Loving each other wasn't enough to erase what Robert Hart had done. It wasn't enough to make the grief go away or the guilt stop eating at them both. What happens now? Vivienne asked eventually, her voice muffled against his chest. Now, Adrian said, we decide what justice looks like. The next few days were a blur of legal consultations and evidence review. Vivienne didn't confront her father immediately. Instead, she did what she did best. She built a case. She used her access as CEO to pull records Adrian had never been able to reach. Financial transfers, email chains, phone logs, everything that proved Robert Hart had orchestrated the Cross family murders and profited from them. When they finally had everything, Vivian called a family dinner. Just the two of them, in the Hart Mansion dining room where Adrian had never been invited. Robert Hart sat at the head of the table, silver-haired and imposing, looking at his daughter with paternal warmth that made Adrian's skin crawl. "This is unusual," Robert said. "You rarely come home for dinner anymore, little Empress." Adrian hated that nickname, the casual possessiveness of it, the way it reduced Vivian to an extension of her father's ego. He watched her stiffen at the words, but maintain her composure. She dressed for this, wearing a power suit that said CEO, not daughter. She'd pulled her hair back severely. She looked like she was going into battle. "I found something interesting in the company archives," Vivian said, placing a folder on the table between them. Records from the Cross Industries acquisition. 2012. Robert's expression didn't change, but Adrian saw the minute tightening around his eyes. "Ancient history, Vivian. Why are you digging up old business deals?" "Because this wasn't a business deal." She opened the folder, revealing the police report, the photographs of twisted metal and broken glass. This was murder. The word hung in the air like smoke. Robert glanced at Adrian for the first time since he'd entered the house. "And who might you be?" "Adrian Cross," he said, letting every ounce of hatred he'd carried for 5 years color his voice. "You killed my family." Robert leaned back in his chair, completely unbothered. "Cross, I thought I recognized the name. You've been working for me for 2 years. A thin smile. "That takes dedication, I'll give you that. But if you think you can prove anything, you're delusional. That accident was investigated and closed." "It was investigated by people you paid," Vivian said. Her voice was cold, harder than Adrian had ever heard it. "But you made a mistake, Dad. You kept records, email chains with your legal team, bank transfers to the mechanic who tampered with their brakes, phone calls to the police chief." She placed each piece of evidence on the table, like cards in a game of poker. "You kept all of it because you thought you were untouchable." Robert's smile faded. He looked at the evidence spread across his dining table, then at his daughter, then back at the documents. "Vivian," he said, and his tone had shifted to something placating. "You don't understand how business works at this level. Sometimes, difficult decisions have to be made." "Difficult decisions," Vivian repeated. Her laugh was sharp, bitter. "You murdered a family. You orphaned a little girl. You stole a company and built an empire on blood, and you're calling it a difficult decision?" "I did it for you." Robert's voice rose for the first time. "Everything I've built, every risk I've taken, it was all for you. To give you the life you deserved, the opportunities, the security. Don't you dare use me as justification." Vivian stood up, and Adrian had never been more proud of another human being. "I never asked for this. I never wanted a legacy built on suffering, and I sure as hell didn't ask you to kill innocent people in my name." Robert turned to Adrian, calculating. "How much do you want? Name your price. I'll write you a check right now. Restitution for your loss. We can make this go away." "You think this is about money?" Adrian's voice was dangerously quiet. "You think you can buy your way out of murdering my parents? My sister?" "Everyone has a price," Robert said, and he actually sounded like he believed it. "Not everyone," Vivian said. She pulled out her phone and pressed a button. "This entire conversation has been recorded, along with every piece of evidence we've gathered. Copies are with my lawyer, Adrian's lawyer, and a journalist who specializes in corporate crime. If anything happens to either of us, it all goes public." She looked at her father with something like grief in her eyes. "I'm giving you one chance, Dad. Turn yourself in. Make this right, or I will destroy you and everything you've built." The silence that followed was suffocating. Robert Hart looked at his daughter, like he was seeing her for the first time. Then he laughed, a cold sound that held no humor. You would betray your own father? For some, nobody who's been using you for revenge. He's not a nobody, Vivienne said. He's the man I love. And more importantly, he's the person who deserves justice for what you did to his family. She moved to stand beside Adrian, a united front. You have 24 hours to contact the authorities. After that, I'm filing everything with the district attorney myself. They left before Robert could respond. Adrian's hands were shaking by the time they reached Vivienne's car. She drove them back to her apartment in silence, both processing what had just happened. It wasn't until they were safely inside that Adrian finally let himself breathe. He won't turn himself in, Adrian said. I know, Vivienne replied. She poured them both whiskey, her hand steady now with purpose. But I had to give him the chance, for my own peace of mind. And when he doesn't, then I follow through. She met his eyes over the rim of her glass. I meant what I said, Adrian. I'm not protecting him. Not anymore. True to Adrian's prediction, Robert Hart didn't turn himself in. He tried to run instead, attempted to flee the country with offshore accounts that Vivienne had frozen the moment they'd left his house. By the time the authorities picked him up at the airport, the story had already broken. CEO's father arrested in decades-old murder case. Every news outlet ran with it, dissecting the cross-family tragedy and Hart Corporation's dubious rise. The media circus was brutal. Reporters camped outside Vivienne's apartment, Hart Corporation headquarters, even Iris's school. Adrian kept Iris home for a week, trying to shield her from the chaos. He explained what he could in 7-year-old terms, that the bad man who had hurt her mommy was going to jail, that sometimes grown-ups did terrible things, but other grown-ups worked to make it right. Iris listened carefully, then asked the question that cut through everything else. Is Miss Vivienne still going to be my friend? Adrian wasn't sure how to answer that. Vivienne had thrown herself into damage control, managing the company through its biggest scandal while simultaneously cooperating with prosecutors. They talked on the phone every night, but Adrian could hear the exhaustion in her voice, the weight of choosing justice over family loyalty. 2 months later, Robert Hart was indicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder, corporate fraud, and conspiracy. Vivienne testified against her own father, reading from the evidence they'd compiled with a voice that never wavered. Adrian watched from the gallery, Iris beside him, as the woman he loved systematically dismantled her father's empire and reputation. When the jury returned with guilty verdicts on all counts, Adrian felt something release in his chest, something he'd been carrying since the night of the accident. It wasn't peace, exactly. His family was still gone. Natalie would never paint again, never see her daughter grow up. But it was justice. Finally, after 5 years, it was justice. Vivienne stepped down as CEO of Hart Corporation 3 days after her father's sentencing. She announced the company would be restructured, with restitution funds going to the Cross family and several ethics reforms implemented. Then she disappeared from public view for 6 weeks. Adrian gave her space, understanding she needed time to process. But he missed her with an intensity that surprised him. Missed her laugh, her coffee addiction, the way she listened to Iris's rambling stories with genuine interest. So when she finally called and asked if they could meet, Adrian said yes before she'd finished the question. They met at an art gallery. Vivienne was standing in front of a painting when Adrian arrived, her hair down and wearing jeans instead of a suit. She looked younger like this, softer. When she turned and saw him, her smile was tentative, but real. "Hi," she said. "Hi yourself." Adrian moved to stand beside her, looking at the painting she'd been studying. It was abstract, all blues and greens flowing together like water. "How are you?" "Surviving," Vivienne said. "Therapy is helping. My lawyer says the civil suits will be settled within a year. I'm working with a nonprofit now, helping victims of corporate crime navigate the legal system." She glanced at him. Turns out there's a lot I can do to make amends without running a Fortune 500 company. You never had to make amends, Adrian said. What your father did. I know. She cut him off gently. I know I'm not responsible for his choices, but I can be responsible for how I respond to them, for using my privilege and knowledge to help others. She paused. I'm trying to figure out who I am without the heart name defining me. It's harder than I expected. They walked through the gallery together, talking about everything and nothing, art and therapy and what came next. Eventually, they ended up in a smaller room displaying works by local artists, and there, on the far wall, was something that made Adrian stop breathing. It was his painting. One of the dozens he'd created over the past 2 years when he couldn't sleep. A portrait of a woman with green eyes and auburn hair, looking at something beyond the frame with an expression caught between hope and sadness. He'd titled it Forgiveness when he'd submitted it months ago, never expecting it to be selected for exhibition. Vivian walked up to the painting slowly. Adrian watched her study his brushstrokes, the way he'd captured light in her hair, the careful detail he'd put into her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. You painted me. Yes, Adrian admitted. I needed to understand how I could hate and love at the same time. How someone could be connected to my family's killer, but also be the person who helped bring him to justice. Painting you was the only way I could make sense of it. Vivian reached out, fingers hovering near the canvas without touching. And did you? Make sense of it? I figured out that hate was easier, Adrian said, but love was true. She turned to face him then, tears on her cheeks but smiling. I don't know if we can make this work, she said. There's so much baggage, so much trauma. We might spend the rest of our lives unpacking what our families did to each other. Probably, Adrian agreed. He took her hand, threading their fingers together. But I'd rather spend my life unpacking trauma with you than running from it alone. That's possibly the least romantic thing anyone has ever said to me, Vivian said, but she was laughing now. And also exactly what I needed to hear. They left the gallery together, hands linked, talking about therapy and art and whether Vivian should get a cat. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There would be hard days ahead, moments when the weight of their history felt too heavy to carry. But they would carry it together. 6 months later, Adrian opened his own gallery. It was small, focused on local artists and community programs. Vivian helped with the business plan, smiling when Adrian's artistic temperament clashed with practical accounting. Iris's artwork hung in the children's section, proud declarations of color and joy that reminded everyone who saw them why art mattered. On opening night, Adrian stood in the center of his gallery, surrounded by people who'd become family. Iris held Vivian's hand, chattering about her latest school project. Vivian listened with that focused attention she gave everything she cared about, and Adrian thought about the letter she'd written a year ago, the one that had started everything. I will be your gift. At the time, it had felt like a curse, a complication he couldn't afford. But looking at them now, at the family they'd become despite everything, Adrian realized Vivian had been right all along. She had been a gift. Not because she was perfect, or because their love erased the past, but because she'd chosen truth, even when it cost her everything. Because she'd stood beside him when she could have walked away. Because she saw him, really saw him, and loved him anyway. Later that night, after the guests had left, and Iris was asleep in Adrian's apartment, he and Vivian stood on the gallery's rooftop, looking at the city lights. She leaned against him, comfortable in the silence they'd learned to share. Any regrets? Adrian asked. Vivian was quiet for a moment, considering. About turning in my father? No. About the letter? No. About falling in love with a man who was planning to destroy my family's empire? She tilted her head up to look at him, eyes bright in the darkness. Not a single one. Adrian kissed her then, gentle and grateful. They'd come through fire to get here. They'd lost things that could never be recovered and hurt each other in ways that would always leave scars. But they'd also found something real in the wreckage, something worth fighting for. "I love you," he said. "I know," Vivian replied. "And I will be your gift, Adrian Cross. Every day, for as long as you'll have me." It was a promise and a choice and a new beginning. In the morning, there would be challenges to face. Iris's therapy sessions, Vivienne's nonprofit work, the ongoing legal battles with Hart Corporation's former board. But tonight, standing on a rooftop with the woman he loved, Adrian let himself believe in second chances. Not because they were easy, but because they were earned through hard work and honest reckoning. Because love that survived truth was the only kind worth having. Somewhere in the city, in a museum dedicated to innovation, the antique brooch sat in a glass case with a plaque reading, "On loan from the Iris Cross Memorial Collection." It had been Vivian's idea to honor Natalie and the family that had been lost. Iris had agreed immediately, proud to share her mother's memory with the world. It was a small gesture, a tiny piece of restitution in the face of enormous wrong. But it mattered. Everything mattered now. The small acts of care, the honest conversations, the choice to show up even when it was hard. Adrian had come to this city for revenge, had built his entire life around the idea of destroying Robert Hart. But in the end, what he'd found was better than revenge. He'd found accountability, justice, and something he'd thought he'd lost the night his family died: hope. The city stretched out before them, full of lights and possibility. And for the first time in 5 years, Adrian looked at the future without seeing ghosts. Just Vivian's hand in his, Iris's laughter echoing in his memory, and the knowledge that broken things could be rebuilt into something stronger than they'd been before. It wasn't the ending he'd imagined when he'd read that letter, but it was the one they'd earned together. And that, Adrian thought, was the greatest gift of all.